Welcome to the second in this webinar series for the North Central London long COVID service. My name is Becky Johnson. I'm a clinical psychologist and I specialise in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. I work in Enfield Therapy Service and I lead the PTSD stream as part of that service. So I've got experience of helping people overcome all kinds of traumatic events, and I hope to share some of that knowledge and skills with you today. We'll also have Karen Greenidge Hutchinson joining us. She's just having some difficulties logging in. She's a facilitator for a mental health service in Barnet, and she's going to share her lived experience of COVID today. So I really hope that she can get in at some point soon. Can we have the next slide, please? So this webinar, what's this webinar going to cover? We're all living through a very challenging time at the moment. We've had over a year now of changing restrictions, of social restrictions, of ever-changing rules and regulations, constant access to worrying news reports and interruptions to all of our daily lives. And COVID has affected, everybody's lives in almost all ways, and for some people the impact has been even greater. And this webinar is aimed at people who have survived COVID, for their friends and families who've witnessed that journey and who have very much have had a COVID journey all of their own. So it's for people who feel like COVID is still having an impact on their life in whatever way that might be. In the next 90 minutes, we're going to cover what trauma is, what PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder is, and what the particular challenges are of COVID, because I think they are really significant. So this is not just experiencing a traumatic event at a normal point in time. This is experiencing a traumatic event at one of the most challenging points of time that many of us have ever lived through. And that is really important when we think about why people might be struggling at the moment. And we're going to learn some basic skills to cope. And Karen, when she joins us, I hope is going to talk to us about her own COVID story of having her husband being unwell with COVID and how that was for her and her family. And she's going to think with us about how she was able to reconnect to her personal strength and values, even in the darkest days. And there's going to be some time for questions, but if you do have any questions as we go along, then please do just put them in the chat box, and then we'll come to them at the end. But it's useful to keep them going as I talk, because things might come up and then you might forget afterwards. Parts of today could potentially be triggering, so this has been written very much with trauma in mind, and I hope that it will feel manageable, but it may well bring up some strong emotions, and if it does, please just look after yourself. If you need to take a break, get a cup of tea, whatever, then please do. I think you can pause the webinar as we go along, and it's going to be recorded, so if today's just not the day, then please look after yourself. You can watch this afterwards if you need to. Okay, so next slide, please. So I wanted to start off with this brilliant picture, which is by Charlie Mackesy, who I think is an artist who has conveyed lots of the mood of COVID so well throughout the last year. And I thought this picture particularly kind of represents where I feel I'm at sometimes. And I've included it because for lots of people, life is very difficult at the moment, and especially for those of you who've had personal journeys of COVID-19. But I hope that from these webinars can come some hope, and I hope it can be part of the journey out from underneath those storm clouds through to where you'd rather be on the other side. So for anyone that can't see the slide, it's a brilliant hand illustration of a horse, the fox and the mole and the boy looking out at some very, very dark storm clouds. And the picture says, "These are dark clouds," said the boy. "Yes, but they will move on," said the horse. "The blue sky above never leaves." And I think for me that feels like a bit of hope that I like to capture, that better days are coming, no matter what you've been through. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what do we mean by trauma? And I think it's a word that we've heard an awful lot, especially over the last year. There's lots been said about this being, a kind of a national trauma, a global trauma, but most of that often focuses on the physical side of COVID. So we know that COVID-19 is a horrible disease that can affect our whole body, all of our organs. And we've heard an awful lot about, the impact that it can have on people's bodies. But what we're going to be thinking about today really is the mental health impact of COVID, and what it's like to have COVID at the time, what it's like to be recovering from COVID, what it's like to be a person witnessing somebody with COVID or recovering from COVID. So that's really what we're going to be talking about today. And, as human beings, we are incredibly resilient, and we are able to weather many storms, overcome many mountains or even mountain ranges. And we, every one of us will have experienced difficult life events. To be human is to suffer in some ways. To be human is to, have a lot of life events thrown at us. And as I say, humans are incredibly good at finding a way through. And we find a way of making sense of what's happened, and we find a way of making it part of our life story. But sometimes something happens to us which is too much. Maybe it's too frightening, too shocking, too overwhelming, and we find ourselves struggling to process what's happening and really struggling to move forward in life. And this, for me, is where the word trauma comes in. This is what we're going to be talking about today. Is a trauma being a life event that has somehow overwhelmed our natural ability to cope. So traumas that just feel too much. And for many people, that's exactly what COVID has been. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just to have a think first. So what are the particular challenges of COVID? Because I think there are some particular challenges, and I think that they make everything that we're going through more difficult, never mind serious illness. So everybody, like I said earlier, everybody has experienced really huge and significant disruptions to their normal life. We've all experienced separation from loved ones, loss of control over day-to-day life, which, is people who largely get used to living in a relatively free society. We aren't used to that. We aren't used to people telling us what we can and can't do, and that can be incredibly stressful, especially when it changes all the time. And for many people, it just feels like their buckets are full already. People with school children, getting very little time to themselves, or young children getting very little social contact, people who live by themselves being very isolated. Everybody's feeling like, I'm full, I've had enough, my resilience is kind of stretched. And that's before COVID-19 kind of traipses and tramples right into your front room. So for those of you who have had experienced COVID themselves, or who have witnessed that in a loved one, then you've already had your full bucket, and then here comes COVID and totally overflows it. And that's really insignificant when we're talking about trauma, because that overflow is all part of that trauma experience, that feeling of being totally overwhelmed. So if we think about, more specifically about what the stresses are that we're all dealing with at the moment, it's disruption to daily lives, it's separation, it's the 24/7 access to worrying news stories about death, about serious illness, about loss of jobs and closure of businesses, and real difficulty having hope that life will get back to normal, or when it will get back to normal, when we can see loved ones again. And that really is filling up those buckets. And then for people like yourself watching the webinar, you've also had to deal with a lot of additional challenges, maybe being unwell and getting that positive result back and just not knowing what is going to happen next. Maybe you've been at home witnessing a loved one get that positive result, and then having to get to the point where you're deciding, should I call an ambulance? Is it safe at hospital? Is it safe at home? And people very much having to hold that themselves on their own, isolated at home, and make those decisions without the social support that they might normally be used to. People have had periods of hospitalisation without visitors, which it would have been perhaps inconceivable before all of this. They will have gone into hospital full of news stories about illness and death, which makes everything incredibly frightening. And people have had long periods of home when their loved one's in hospital, and they've been at home by themselves potentially, or looking after children or other family members, without knowing how their loved one is doing, and without being able to see or speak to them. So all of this is absolutely filling up that sense of too much. This is too much. This is one mountain too many. And if you've been in hospital with COVID in ICU, you've likely felt very frightened, very confused, very unsure of what's happening to you or when you might be able to go home. And you will have been full of the news stories of COVID being something that's very difficult to recover from or can take a long time. And so it's very valid that people start to have worries about, when will I recover? Will this affect my health forever? And all of these things are really significant factors that make a trauma much more difficult to overcome. So really kind of making your bucket feel like it's overflowing. Okay. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm going to talk now a little bit more about trauma. And on the left-hand side of the screen is the blue box, and that's talking about what would ideally happen after a trauma. And then the blue box is why that's more difficult at the moment and why more people might be struggling than might have normally been struggling with a serious illness or a big traumatic event in their life. So usually after a trauma, or ideally after a trauma, we would see people use their natural coping styles. So they would have a really kind of an individual but quite a normal coping style that they would be using to make sense of what they've been through and to process what's happened to them. So in the days after a trauma, such as a car crash, we would spend time thinking about what's happened to us. We would talk it through with people, and we might talk it through like it's the only thing that's ever happened, again and again and again. And we might hear about it from other people's perspective. So we might hear from the passengers, for example, or we might have to talk it through with the insurance company or the police or witnesses in some way. And all of that helps us to make sense of what happened. So, we kind of integrate those other narratives into our experience to help us make sense of it. We would likely dream about it. And for the few days afterwards, these memories would feel really strong and really intense. And people can describe, in the days after a trauma, every time they think about it, they feel like, they're back in the car again, or they're back in that very frightening place again. And this process of relaying the event over and over again is really, really natural, really normal and really healthy, because it helps us make sense and it helps our coping strategies kick in. It helps our support network know that we need help, that we're struggling, and it helps us make sense and make a story out of what's happened to us. And once we've got that story, we just integrate it as part of our life, so it becomes part of who we are. We don't ever forget it, but the emotions start to reduce and it becomes just part of this kind of rich narrative of who we are as a person. And that's what normally would happen. And like I said, we've all been through challenging life events. There won't be anybody who hasn't been through some sort of trauma in their life that they've had to make sense of. But that's what we do as humans. We process it, we make sense of it, and then it becomes part of our life story. So if we think about what the extra challenges of COVID are that make all of this more difficult, we're going over to the red side now. So everyone, like I said, everyone's bucket is pretty full at the moment. So whereas, pre-COVID, we might have been able to tolerate having 2-3 weeks where we felt more anxious, more overwhelmed, unable to go to work, for example, we might have been able to tolerate that because things might have been going otherwise kind of okay. What's happening at the moment is people feel like they can't tolerate that. It all feels too much. And we're surrounded by this kind of worrying news. We're surrounded by this sense of uncertainty, and all of this makes things much more difficult to make sense of. And if we think about, so if we focus now on people who've had COVID themselves and might have been in hospital with that, there's lots of things that make, hospitals a frightening place to be anyway when you've got a serious illness. But there's lots of things that make hospital feel slightly safer or slightly less frightening. And not a lot of that is able to happen at the moment. So if we think about somebody on an ICU ward with COVID, they're more likely to be sedated with breathing equipment. And all of that can make something called delirium more likely. So if we're in hospital and we're sedated, we might be experiencing delirium, which can make us feel very confused. And that can pose some extra challenges for people when they're trying to make sense of what's happened. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. They also can't have visitors who can offer that kind of reassuring, familiar voice by their bedside. And even if that person can't really do anything to help, just having, you know, a familiar voice there could make all the difference with someone feeling safe. And that's really important when we're very unwell. All the staff around us are wearing full PPE, where, you know, they've got their masks on, they've got their shields on, they've got, you know, kind of hazmat suits on almost. And, you know, where that might have been a reassuring, friendly face beforehand that, you know, might be able to kind of hold their hand when something painful happens, that's not happening at the moment. And for somebody who's feeling confused, feeling, you know, kind of in a state of delirium, having staff around them that look so unusual and so unapproachable, so unfriendly, can make a big difference to how frightening it all is and how frightened they feel. You know, prior to admission, people go into hospital surrounded by lots of the frightening news reports about death rates, and so it all feels much more frightening than it might have done pre-COVID. And then after being discharged, you know, we can't go back to that necessarily back to that nice support network that we might have had otherwise, where we can't go back and, you know, meet up with friends and family who will be able to give us all those different sides of the story or fact check some of the things that we're talking about. And we can't go back to those daily routines and rituals that might have otherwise helped us make sense of things. So, you know, we might have been able to go back to work at some point and have those kind of coffee machine chats with people where we can just fill them in on how we're doing. And now, if we're now working from home instead, we're really isolated and we're not having that, you know, that social input that really helps us feel like we're getting back to normal. And if we think about, if you're a person who's witnessed somebody else have severe COVID, you know, life hasn't been normal for you either to try and make sense of all of this. You won't have been able to visit your loved ones and feel like you were having an active part in that person's recovery or that person's illness, which can make people feel really helpless and really hopeless. You're not being able to see friends or family to talk about what's going on and how you're doing and how they're doing. So people feeling very, very much alone with their difficulties. You won't have been able to necessarily just do those daily rituals that might have filled the day slightly. So doing the school run, you know, and just having those kind of chit chats with people at the school gates, or doing your commute to work, or even the commute to the hospital, which, you know, we wouldn't have even thought about before, but that might be 2 hours of the day gone just commuting, and we don't have that now. So we're much more surrounded by our own thoughts and our own worrying thoughts. We're constantly surrounded by that news and the ever-changing regulations, and all of this just really wears away at our resilience. So all of those natural coping strategies that we would have otherwise had just aren't there. And all in all, we're just left trying to overcome one of the absolute greatest challenges of our lives at a time of low social support and when our resilience and resources feel at rock bottom. So I suppose all of this really, what I'm trying to say is, if you're finding all of this too hard, then it's because it's too hard. If you're struggling, then that doesn't mean that you're weak or you're broken. It means that you're a human being who's been through too much, who's been through an incredibly hard time and needs some support. And that really is where the trauma of COVID, I think, starts to need potentially some support from services or some specialist information, because it can really stop people from being able to move forward in life and really make sense of what they've been through. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so I felt like that was quite a heavy slide. So I wanted to, move on now to think a little bit about something that we call post-traumatic growth. And this bowl that you can see is, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but it's kintsugi or something similar to that. So it's a Japanese art where you get a perfectly good bowl, and a perfectly nice bowl. It works, it holds soup or liquid or whatever it's meant to hold. And then what we do is we break it and then we fix it again using this really nice gold paint. And the idea of this being that sometimes the process of being broken and put back together again can somehow enrich us or add something rather than just taking away. And for lots of people who've been through trauma, this is absolutely what we see. So We know that people can overcome severe adversity and find a way through. But for lots of people, once they've had the right support, they've processed what they've been through, they find a way of weaving that traumatic experience into their life story and actually feeling like, you know, maybe it added something, maybe they've learned something from that experience, maybe it's strengthened their relationships or given them a greater appreciation for life or appreciation for their health. Maybe it's given them more empathy for other people. Maybe it's given them a new lease of life in some way. And, you know, this isn't everybody. And if you're not feeling this way at the moment, then that's absolutely normal as well. But I suppose it is that hope that sometimes the process of going through something traumatic can, you know, eventually add something to our life rather than just being something that feels it's taken away. And that can take time for people, but it absolutely is, you know, is what happens for some people. Okay, can we have the next slide? I think we were going to move to Karen now to tell us a little bit about her experiences of COVID, but I think, unfortunately, I think she's having some difficulties logging in. So I'm not sure whether to do it on her behalf or maybe we just move on, which is a shame because I think, you know, Karen's experience was, you know, going to be really important to share, but maybe we can find a different way of doing that at another time. But if we just move on to the next slide and I can carry on going. So what we're going to think about next, we thought a little bit about what trauma means, and now we're going to think a little bit about what post-traumatic stress disorder is, so sometimes called PTSD. PTSD is a term that we use to describe a collection of symptoms that can arise after a traumatic event. So it's a term that we would use to describe, we call it a mental health condition, but really what it is saying you've been through a trauma in the past that has caused you to have some difficulties now that are really disrupting the way you want to live your life. That's what PTSD is. And it tends to come for about 20 to 30% of people after you've experienced a trauma. And after an ICU experience, people think it's about 20%, 25%. And this can vary an awful lot depending on what type of trauma you've been through. So obviously it varies hugely, and there's lots of other factors as well that can impact on whether or not you develop PTSD. But it can affect men and women, children. It's seen kind of cross-culturally, and really it's, you know, it's something that is very well recognised as being the result of going through a trauma which was too much for your mind to process. And the fact that 20 to 30% of people will experience PTSD really highlights two things to me. One is that human beings are incredible at finding a way through. So I work in a trauma service every day with people who have experienced all the traumas imaginable, and I'm always struck by how people do find a way to survive the trauma, and they find a way to survive the after effects of the trauma. And you know, the human resilience should never be overlooked. But it also highlights to me that we should be expecting a significant number of people who've survived COVID-19 to need some sort of psychological support over the next few months and years to come. And this very much includes both people who've had COVID themselves, but also for the people who've witnessed that COVID in that person. So, you know, the person's loved ones, their friends, their families. We would absolutely anticipate that some of those people will go on to develop troubling symptoms that we might call PTSD. So if, you know, even if you haven't had COVID yourself, you might absolutely be experiencing some of this. And treatment for PTSD is absolutely available and it is effective. It's available on the NHS. And the best place to start is usually to go and see your GP. If you've been in hospital with COVID and there's a post-ICU team, then you could speak to them as well. And there's lots of useful websites and apps that I can distribute after the webinar. Like I said, PTSD, the rates of getting PTSD can vary slightly on what kind of trauma you've been through, but also if you've been through traumas before you've developed COVID-19, then that can make you more vulnerable to developing something like PTSD. So if that's you, then, you know, please keep an extra check on yourself and you know, keep an extra check on whether you might be needing some support in all of this. because you might be more likely to struggle. But please do seek help. Help is available and it is effective, so please do speak to somebody. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm just going to run through what the symptoms of PTSD are. And people with PTSD might describe some or all of the following symptoms. And we would usually only really say that it's PTSD a month or so after the trauma itself, because like I said, it's absolutely normal and healthy straight after a trauma to have all of these symptoms. So in the days and the few weeks after the trauma, we would expect pretty much everybody to be having all of this, and we wouldn't be saying, you need some therapy for this, because that's absolutely healthy and normal. It's only really if these symptoms carry on for a longer period of time or are really getting in the way of how you can live your life longer term. So what do people describe? People can describe intrusive memories. So what we mean by this is memories that just kind of pop into your mind when you're not already thinking about the trauma, or when you notice you're being kind of triggered by something. And these memories feel more than just a memory. So these memories can feel really vivid or really real in some way, and can make you feel under threat once again. So whatever emotion you had at the time, you'll find yourself re-experiencing that emotion when you have an intrusive memory. People describe nightmares, and these can be directly related to the trauma, or they might be along a similar theme. Themes of feeling unsafe or trapped in some way, or loved ones being unsafe in some way is quite common. People can describe flashbacks. So flashbacks are kind of very, very, very vivid memories where it can feel like we're back at the time of the trauma again. And where people can find that they don't really have a sense of reality of where they are right now, because they just feel like they're back at the time. And that can last for a second or a minute or so. People can describe feeling constantly jumpy or on edge, or feeling very frightened or anxious, and this can be particularly if there's something quite triggering in the environment. So you might notice it where if you're out and about and somebody coughs, for example, that really triggers that sense of kind of, oh my goodness, something bad's about to happen, I'm going to catch it again. Or just really feeling unsafe, or when a news bulletin comes on, that might trigger a real kind of sense of I'm not safe, I'm in danger, and a real bodily sense of anxiety, which might be your heart rate speeding up, noticing yourself feeling quite sweaty, or quite cold, or pins and needly, or even feeling like you can't breathe. These are all really kind of normal and normal symptoms of anxiety that are absolutely safe. You can't be hurt by these symptoms, but they do feel quite frightening. Lots and lots of people with PTSD describe having trouble sleeping. So I'd say I've never met somebody with PTSD who doesn't describe sleeping problems, and that's because frightened minds and bodies don't like going to sleep because they don't feel safe enough to go to sleep. And people will really talk about avoiding triggers. So they will avoid things that are likely to trigger this feeling of unsafety, which is absolutely natural. If we touch fire once, everything in our body is screaming at us not to touch it again. So people, after a COVID-19 experience, might find themselves avoiding watching the news, avoiding watching medical dramas. They might avoid talking to anybody because they might ask them how they are, and that might trigger some kind of difficult memories for them. And they might avoid leaving the house because they're fearful of catching things again. If Karen was here, she was going to talk about how in the days while her husband was very unwell, she was finding everything frightening, and was starting to do rituals like cleaning everything 3 times, or wiping down all of her surfaces again and again and again, because everything just suddenly felt really unsafe. And she was finding it difficult to go out of the house, for example, because of this fear of just everything she felt incredibly vulnerable all of a sudden. And just everything felt really, really dangerous, and so it's very natural then that we would avoid doing these things. And it's not problematic in the short term, I suppose. It's a very normal coping strategy. We would only say it's problematic if it's going on a long time, or it's really disrupting the way you live your life. So if you are not now able to go to work, for example, then that's a problem. And that's where you might need to start getting some help. And that's where really avoidance becomes problematic. Some people with PTSD describe feeling really disconnected from themselves or from their experience. So they might look back on their time in ICU and just feel like, I don't even think that really happened to me, or, it's really hard to know and to feel like that happened to me rather than just to somebody else. Or when they think back to their time, it might feel like it's almost like an out-of-body experience. And we call this dissociation. And again, this is a really normal, natural and healthy way to cope with trauma, because if something feels too much, your mind basically says kind of, let's get out of here, and it will separate you from the trauma. And that is a healthy coping strategy or survival strategy. It becomes problematic in the long term when we keep on using that survival strategy, even when we're not in danger anymore, because that really stops us from being able to live a healthy and meaningful life. If we can't connect with the people that we love, we can't feel part of our own body and our own experience anymore, then we can't carry on living a good and meaningful life. So again, this is something that can be absolutely healthy in the early days, but problematic if it carries on for a longer period of time. The final point is around specific problems that can come out of ICU. So if you've been in ICU, and lots of people who are in ICU, and especially with COVID, because of the amount of sedation that's needed and the breathing equipment that's needed, people are describing kind of lots of quite bizarre or strange memories from that time in ICU. And that, like I said, is due to the sedation, the medication, and how unwell people are. And we call this, periods of delirium. And when we are delirious, we have a really difficult time of making sense of what's going on around us. And so our mind is kind of compromised. It's not thinking clearly. It can't make clear sense of what's going on. And so it tries its best to make sense of what's happening, but it might come to some quite kind of unusual conclusions about what's going on because of the medication, because of the delirium. And that can make people feel quite frightened. So your brain might come to some quite frightening conclusions about what's going on, for example. And when people recover, people can describe still having these, strange or bizarre memories that are coming back to them, and they can't work out, did this happen or did this not happen? Was this real or did I dream it? Or for somebody who's, living with someone who's had these strange experiences, they might be watching and thinking, I don't know what they're talking about, or surely that can't have happened, or, I think people can worry they're going mad, is what lots of people describe, because these memories feel incredibly real, but there are things that surely can't have happened. And this really does happen because your brain is absolutely trying its best to make sense of what's going on, but it's doing that at a time when it's feeling delirious, it's very heavily medicated, and it's very unwell. So for example, somebody who's sedated on ICU might remember and have these kind of vivid memories of seeing scary people walking around, and these scary people are holding them hostage and they are hurting them, and they believe that they're being kept somewhere very unsafe and they're being restrained. Okay, and that's what conclusions somebody's mind might have come to when they were in this delirious state. Now, once they begin to recover, they carry on having these memories, and they're very frightening because it's hard to make sense of. Now, what can be really helpful is, after that person starts to recover, is having other people add in information that is more factual, is what wasn't from the mind of someone who was really unwell. So that might be talking to the ICU team, who can, sometimes they keep an ICU diary, for example, where someone can have these bizarre memories that then can be aligned to the ICU diary and say, actually, well, that was the day you had this procedure. So that painful experience that you remember happening was actually somebody looking after you and somebody kind of taking care of you. And those strange figures that you remember seeing were actually staff in PPE. So they weren't these kind of harmful, bad people. They were actually, the nurses who were really caring for you, but you couldn't see their reassuring faces because they were wearing masks and shields. And that experience of being restrained was actually you know, you being kind of safely held to the bed, because otherwise people might pull out their lines and their trains. So when we start to unpick some of these bizarre and strange memories, we can start to help people to make sense of and make that really important story about what happened to them. And that way people can, you know, do that whole process of making sense of, processing it and putting it in the past. And your brain can kind of get to grips with what happened, and it no longer needs to be this kind of, I'm going mad, I've had these kind of unreal experiences, no one believes me, this really kind of, you know, frightening experience. It can become something that can be understood and can be part of your COVID story. But that might need some outside help. So if we go to the next slide, that was going to be Karen again. So if we skip to the next one. So Karen was just going to talk a little bit about, actually, if we go back, and maybe I can just talk briefly about what I know Karen was going to say, because I think it was important. I'm hoping that Karen won't mind me sharing. So Karen was going to talk about her husband's experience of being in ICU. So he was in a coma for 3 weeks in ICU, and you know, something that really struck me was Karen talking about how frightening that was for him, but also for her and her daughter. And I spoke already about how, you know, she found herself just kind of trying to do anything to make herself feel a bit safer, in terms of cleaning things lots and lots, and trying to, for her and her daughter, really to kind of rally together. But she described it as being kind of scrabbling around in the dark and nothing felt familiar, is how she described it. Just this real sense of being really vulnerable. But she also talked about her husband, that he had these strange memories that he wasn't able to distinguish, you know, are these true or are these not, of having strange memories of kind of having to pay for some of his ICU experience and having to use his credit card. And just kind of feeling like that wasn't right, I think. And, you know, Karen then being at home and thinking this can't possibly have happened, but for him that absolutely felt real. And I think over the last year they've really kind of worked together to try and make sense of that experience, and it's been very helpful for both of them, I think, to try and get some sense into that. So if we just go to the next slide. So what we're going to think about now is how we cope with some of these distressing feelings. So trauma, like I said, makes us feel vulnerable, it makes us feel anxious, and it makes us feel like another bad thing can happen again at any moment. And we can feel quite anxious and panicky or irritable and kind of on edge. And all of this affects how we breathe, because when we're anxious, our body starts to get ready to fight or to flight or to freeze. And it does this by changing how we breathe. So we breathe more quickly as a way of getting lots of oxygen into our body so that we're able to do this kind of fight or flight. So a really good way of calming our bodies down again is to change how we breathe. So what we want is for our body to get into this nice kind of soothing rhythm, is what we want. And it's a way of slowing down our breathing, calming down our body, so that we're able to say, this is a memory, this is not happening now, I'm safe now, I'm at home, or, you know, I'm safe now, I'm with, you know, the staff who can help me, I'm with nurses who are trying to help me. So this is a breathing exercise that can be helpful when we start to notice anxious feelings, or when we know we're going into a triggering situation. So, you know, we've got a medical appointment, we know there's a COVID briefing coming on the news, or, you know, when we know we're about to leave the house and we might feel a bit breathless, and that's likely to trigger some kind of worrying thoughts about our health. So to do soothing rhythm breathing, what we're trying to do is we're trying to slow our breathing down. And we're trying to, when we're anxious, we breathe from our chest. We breathe quickly, and it's all from up here. And when we're trying to do slow breathing, we want to go through our nose, and we want to slowly push the air down into our stomach. And we want to imagine that we've got a balloon in our stomach. And every time we breathe in, we are slowly inflating that balloon. So we want to feel our stomach wall. Okay, I think I might have lost my internet then, but I think I'm back. Okay, so I was just saying about the breathing exercise. So what we're trying to do is to I like to imagine myself being on a swing. So when we're doing this soothing rhythm breathing, we're trying to get it so that our in-breath is the same length as our out-breath. Okay, so we're imagining that we're on that swing in the park and we're going forwards and backwards. And it doesn't really matter how long the breaths are. The important thing is that they're the same length. Okay, so we might breathe in for 1, 2, and then we'll breathe out for 1, 2. Okay, if you can do longer, then great, but it doesn't matter. It's just, it needs to be that nice rhythm. Okay, so you're trying to practice that of breathing in and out, and in and out. Okay, and that rhythm will really help your body to calm down and for your brain to be able to think clearly again and to be able to reassure your mind and your body that you're safe, you're okay. Okay, and don't try and do this for the first time when you're already feeling anxious. Try and practice it when you're feeling nice and calm so that your body can learn it, and then when you are anxious it will feel much easier to kind of pull it out of the first aid kit and do this. And you're really trying to keep your chest still, breathe from your stomach, in and out of your nose in that nice calm rhythm. Okay, and that's really going to help your brain and your body feel prepared to manage anxiety. And there's going to be some more webinars later on that are going to cover this in a bit more detail, and one on mindfulness as well, which is another really good way of managing kind of anxious thoughts and feelings. So that's in a few weeks' time, I think. So if we can just do the next slide. So the next exercise is all about keeping ourselves grounded. And this is a really useful exercise for managing trauma-related symptoms. Because when we have been through a trauma and it's still affecting our lives, we can have these kind of horrible memories from the past and they absolutely transport us back to this frightening time. Or we might have worries about the future. And again, it transports us away from where we are now to this worrying time, and that affects how we feel, it affects our bodies. And what these grounding exercises do is they absolutely bring us back to this present moment. So I've got my feet, I always think it's about having your feet on the ground and saying, I'm here right now. And it forces your attention back to the very moment. So this exercise, we call it the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it's a really useful one to use when you're noticing yourself being pulled back to traumatic memories or pulled forward to worrying thoughts. And it's really simple. You don't need anything, although you can have a few bits if you want to prepare yourself. But what you do, and you can do it now, is you look around where you are right now and you look for 5 things that you can see. So I can see a mirror, I can see my laptop, I can see my phone, I can see my water bottle, and I can see a picture on the wall. Okay. Then you think, well, what 4 things can I hear? I can hear my laptop whirring. I can hear an aeroplane, I think, outside. I can hear a bird, and I can hear some traffic on the road. Okay. What things can I touch? So I'm anxiously playing with an elastic band in my hand. I can feel that. Okay. I can feel my sleeve. Okay, and I can feel my glasses. Those are 3 things that I can absolutely feel right here, right now. Now I think about what 2 things can I smell. So I can smell my fabric softener, and I can smell my conditioner. Okay, and then you think, well, what 1 thing can I taste? So I might not be able to taste anything, but I might be able to taste my finger. Or if I'm preparing to do this, then I might have brought some strong mints with me, for example, that I could put in my mouth and really focus on the taste that's right here, right now. And similarly with smell, if I know I'm going to want to do this exercise, then I can bring some essential oils, for example, or a smell that really makes me feel safe. So, like lemon, if that reminds you of making lemon cake, or I don't know, something that kind of makes you have kind of safe and warm feelings. So this is an exercise that you can do whenever you want to, but you can also prepare for if you know that you're going to be going into quite a triggering or difficult situation. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide, which is Karen was going to talk to you about how she managed and how her and her daughter managed, but I'll just briefly talk you through it. So Karen talked about finding things, understandably incredibly difficult, and really finding, like I said, kind of feeling like she was in the dark and feeling around for something that felt familiar and not being able to find anything actually for quite a while. And what her and her daughter started to do was craft. So it really was something that helped her to kind of bring her back to something that she maybe hadn't thought about for a while, but something that really kind of centered her and grounded her, and really made her think about, you know, that life's okay, even at the darkest of moments. Karen described that sense of kind of, I'm allowed to have lighter moments as well, and her and her daughter kind of really enjoyed putting these things together. Really thinking, I think that the tree picture in particular is based on a therapy called the Tree of Life, where you think a lot about, you know, where you've come from and what gives you strength, and what family stories are important to you, and who's important to you, and what gifts those people have given to you. And they made this tree picture to really represent the process that they went through together. So for Karen, it was this idea of, you know, using this kind of very hands-on crafting as a way of distracting herself, but also giving herself something to kind of focus on. It was something she could achieve. It was something to kind of focus the mind and focus on strength and resilience. So if we go to the next slide. So what next? We've talked about a lot today, and, you know, I hope it felt manageable. If you are struggling, then please talk to somebody. As I said earlier, if you're finding this too hard, then it's because it's too hard. It's not because you're weak or you're broken in some way. It's because you need some help, and lots of people do need help after they've been through a trauma. And the first steps might be to start doing things to help you make sense of what's happened. You know, I've talked a lot today about finding a way to make this part of your life story, and there's lots of ways of doing that. So talking to people is absolutely a way of doing it. But if that feels too much, or, you know, you don't have people that you trust or can use in that way, can support you in that way, then try writing things down. Try writing down, just, you know, freehand your experiences, or try creating yourself a timeline of what happened when. It can really help people to start stitching things together. You know, if you've been in hospital, then see if there's an ICU diary or somebody who can help to fill in some of the gaps, or help to make sense of some of your experiences. You know, try making things. Sometimes having your, you know, real hands-on experiences can be really helpful. Or try connecting with people online. You know, online can sometimes be a really helpful resource. There'll be lots of people out there who have absolutely been through really similar things and need support themselves, and that peer support can be something that's really invaluable. If you do feel like you need to talk to somebody professional, then, you know, there are services out there. I've put on the slide here about the ICU experience support group, which is ICU Steps. There's a really good website there that, you know, is set up by past ICU patients and really can help people make sense of experiences there. There's a website called Psychology Tools that has got a really brilliant booklet on post-COVID ICU experiences that explains lots of things, and has got some useful exercises for people to go through. There's quite a few apps available. So there's one called PTSD Coach, for example, that can help you understand symptoms and track symptoms to try and work out what's triggering for you. And if you do feel like you need to speak to somebody, then, like I said, if you've been in hospital, you can speak to medical staff there. There's often post ICU clinics that you can go to. The long COVID treatment pathway that you've probably heard about this webinar through, do speak to them. They are linked into your local mental health teams, and do speak to your GP. They can absolutely discuss referral for psychological therapy if that's the next step for you. But please do get help. It's effective and it's available, and there is, you know, hope at the end of this. Okay, so I think we've got questions next, if there are any. I'm not sure if there are any questions coming, or...
Yes, there are. Becky, hang on a sec, I will read them.
Great.
Okay, someone has said, I tested positive to antibodies and have since been poorly. I've been having palpitation issues for more than 3 months now. My heart rate sometimes keeps me awake all night and is concerning. My GP is aware. I've been sent for a blood test. I'm now living with this health problem. My question is, could this be as a result of COVID? All investigations were positive.
And in terms of the physical health side of it, I really wouldn't want to answer that in terms of the potential for this to be a physical health problem. But you know, feeling kind of things like heart palpitations can also absolutely be a sign of anxiety. So like I said before, when we feel anxious, our body tends to go into fight or flight mode, and it can increase our breathing rate. And some people can start to have anxieties that they're going to have a heart attack, for example, that they're not going to be able to breathe. And you know, sometimes we do need physical investigations to rule out a physical cause, so that would be useful to look at through the GP, or if you're part of the long COVID treatment pathway. If there's, you know, if you're wondering if this might be anxiety, a good way of starting to tell is, you know, do breathing exercises help? So you know, is there an obvious trigger which would explain why anxiety, you know, as something happened in your environment and then these breathing difficulties come? Because if so, that might be a sign that anxiety is playing a key part. Or, you know, when these breathing difficulties or palpitations start, do breathing exercises calm them down again? Because that might be quite a good sign that this is anxiety fueling this rather than a physical health problem. So if you try something like the soothing rhythm breathing and you notice that it helps, then that might be, like I say, a good sign that anxiety is playing a part here. But if you are worried, then, you know, speak to the GP, speak to the long COVID treatment pathway. They may well be able to point you in the right direction.
Okay, Karen is here now, if Karen would like to speak. You're on mute at the moment, Karen.
Sorry. Hi everyone. My name's Karen. I'm a facilitator for a mental health service in Barnet, and I'm here today to share my COVID and trauma experience with you. And I have got a slide here on there somewhere. But last year, my husband contracted COVID. That was the height of the COVID pandemic, when we were getting all those, and still are to a degree, but getting all the news about the COVID casualties, the numbers and the deaths. We were getting that continually day after day, when it felt like hour after hour. And then my husband fell ill. He was put into an induced coma for 3 weeks. And then we suddenly found ourselves in the very same situation. We were watching on the news, which kind of, I think through watching the news so much prior to him falling ill, kind of almost straight away put us into kind of a real alert and panic situation when we found out that he had actually been diagnosed with COVID. And I remember when the ambulance came to take him to hospital, and they came into our house, and they were dressed in a way which we wouldn't normally see ambulance men. They had the masks, they had special kind of white coats over them, overalls, and things over their feet. And so again, that whole process from kind of watching it on the news and kind of all that information coming into your home, and then my husband falling ill, and suddenly all this, the COVID was coming into our home. And then what kind of really brought it, you know, really to our attention even more, this different engagement we were having, you know, with the ambulance, as to men, the people, the way they looked. And so, and when he was being taken to hospital, and then I, you know, automatically feeling that I need to kind of go and comfort him, and then being told, no, you know, COVID protocols are that you can't come in the ambulance and you can't come to the hospital. So, you know, not only was I not able to go and comfort him in that time for what he was going through because of the restrictions, I found myself not being able to be comforted either, because at that time no one was allowed to be coming into your home, especially obviously if someone's been diagnosed with COVID. So I find myself with being kind of with these emotions of fear, panic, anxiety and paranoia to a large degree, and that was because we found ourselves in this really unfamiliar ground. We weren't really geared for it. We didn't quite know how to manage it. Like, how are we now supposed to deal with this this kind of illness, supporting him, and how are we now supposed to support ourselves? And so I found myself kind of going into what I felt at the time was very much a way of protecting us. So I was kind of really obsessively cleaning everything, and almost to a ritual degree, with spraying things a certain amount of times, and it just kind of felt like that COVID was all around us. It was not just so much my husband who was ill, but also it was in our environment. It was in the air, so it just felt very unsafe. And at the same time, it was an unfamiliar place we found ourselves in, so there was no reference, so we're just trying to make sense of it, and it really did feel like we were feeling around in the dark, just trying to find this really safe place, and so for me, having to just kind of create the safe place by doing these things which in hindsight were actually quite deliberately obsessive, because I just felt I had to keep doing them all the time, continually, and having nobody to kind of speak to, or kind of to be able to hug or comfort, because again, you're really quite separated at that time from the whole physical contact with people. And so if I'll just kind of go straight on to speak about, in all of that, how we kind of were able to find a coping mechanism for ourselves, and what we did, and this is kind of our the kind of mind's ability, or our mind's ability at that time, to find some kind of hope in this whole what felt like a chaotic situation. And so we started to do some craft work, and I'm somebody, luckily, who has always had things, colourful paper, different things you can stick, and coloured boards, all kinds of things in the home. And they would be there for ages, just kind of like gathering dust, because until we wouldn't use them anymore. But at this particular time, we found an absolute fantastic use for them, because it was a distraction. It channeled our minds. It gave us some balance, and it gave us also a sense of achievement that we could see something really good at the end. And so we started to get little canvas boards and give ourselves little messages. And the one in the middle was really quite poignant and important to me at the time, where it says, "I am strong, I am healthy, I'm well," because I had to kind of almost give myself this continuous reminder that I am these things. I am healthy. There's no evidence to say I'm not, although I was feeling that I was unwell, because obviously I'm feeling that everything around me is with COVID. So I'm healthy, I'm well, I am strong, and I kind of had that kind of put up on the wall, just above the television, so I could just kind of see this every morning when I woke up. And also, the tree of hope was our way of saying that, there is hope in all this situation. We are kind of getting through. So we had these things as our reminders, and we found a lot of help and kind of benefit in the making these craft items. We did quite a few of them, and also some painting as well. These are probably three of the better ones. But it was a really useful distraction, and a creative one. So it helped kind of reinforce the fact that there is there is hope, and you are managing, you are kind of getting through. And just to kind of add to that, and when I, in reflection, when I kind of think about kind of retelling that story, but retelling it in a way that I'm thinking about actually, we did get through that, what kind of helped us through that. And I'd kind of written something which said, that it was able to kind of, I was able to kind of retell it, and when I'm retelling it, appreciate the things that were going on around me at the time, the passion and the kindness that I was showing from people just kind of wanting to help, neighbours I might not have spoken to all the time, but don't live directly next to me, but further up, but know what was going on, and just kind of offering help. In some way, it might have been just kind of recognising I can't get out at this time, so dropping off bread or sugar or something, to find food, little parcels outside the door. So that was really kind of nice, and just also recognising that vulnerability was okay, to be able to accept that, to not look at it as a weakness, that it was okay to show that vulnerability. Because I had this thing in the beginning that I have to be strong, I've got to be always showing that I'm managing. And actually, when I think back on it, when I've got to the point of actually accepting vulnerability as a quality, a human quality, and there's nothing wrong with being able to kind of show that you might be experiencing weakness at a particular time, and at the same time recognising that I was able to accept the vulnerability, but also recognise that I was expressing some resilience, because in how we were finding our way to kind of get ourselves through day to day, and so I think it was important as part of the recovery journey, not only just for ourselves, but also for my husband to be able to recognise that there's hope. So for him, I mean, we kind of found a way to kind of manage ourselves through with the expression, although with our craft work. But for him, when he came out of hospital, and his trauma didn't necessarily stop when he left hospital. When he came into the home now, it was almost a different environment, but still trauma. So he was having to manage different kind of emotions, as far as he now had to deal with these vivid dreams that he couldn't kind of make sense of. He was struggling with what was reality and what wasn't reality, and not being able to understand, how make sense of how these dreams feeling so real, and looking to me to have some kind of answer, but we were kind of again feeling around the dark because we didn't have a name for this thing at the time, and when he had a conversation with his doctor, then they mentioned PTSD. They mentioned can hear me, I hope you can all hear me. They mentioned PTSD, and they mentioned delirium. And when they explained all these things, it began to make sense. It began to, we could say, okay, we can understand what you're going through, your feeling of uncertainty, your triggers, your flashbacks. You're feeling unsettled and fearful. We can put this down to PTSD. So that having a label, having a name to put to all these emotions and these actions really helped with the recovery, because there was a point where he was feeling he was his mental health. He was really concerned about his mental health, and although he was kind of going through these traumatic events, we were as well, but in a different way. Ours was about how we were managing this in the home, and his was about his in the hospital, but also how he's kind of surviving going for his continued recovery journey. But being able to get a name to things helped us to be able to maintain, to be able to move forward with some kind of understanding of what we're dealing with, and that really kind of helped move things along and removed some of the fear, and kind of replaced more with hope, because we can see kind of, okay, there is something, we know what we're doing now. There's something kind of more tangible in as much as a name for what was happening, and we removed some of that kind of fear that we know we have no control, we don't know what's going on, all these things are happening to us without the support around us. So it was, it was a very kind of a traumatic time, although again, even saying traumatic, it was like, okay, we can recognize it was traumatic and accept that. But kind of, when I was speaking earlier about retelling the story and thinking about what helped us through, it was important when it was recognizing the trauma, but still recognizing there was some strengths in there, and we actually managed to get through because of these various helps and qualities from people around us and from ourselves. So yeah, it was, it was a very in a continued recovery journey. So thank you. If anybody's got any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box.
Iris, would you like to do this, or shall I? Okay. Someone said this might be a question for Becky. Could you please elaborate on what you said about having already had trauma experience and then getting COVID?
Karen, would you mind just putting your on mute, because it makes me echo? Thank you. Yeah, so what I said earlier, in case anyone missed it, is that if you went into COVID already having trauma, then that might make you more likely to develop something like PTSD or to struggle more afterwards. And what I mean by that is that when we go into a trauma, we are taking our lives with us. So, we go through life, like I said, creating a story about ourselves and about the world and about other people. So if we've been lucky enough to have a safe and good life until that point, then we will go into COVID-19 with a sense of ourselves being somebody who good things happen to and who people will support us and the world is safe. And that will, be infinitely helpful often. Not always, often, because it helps us to feel hopeful when we go through a traumatic experience, because we have a sense of people will help me, the world will be okay, the world is a safe place. For some people, sadly, that's not their early experiences. They go into COVID-19 as someone who's perhaps had some, already frightening times that have made them feel like the world is a little bit unsafe, or in terms of trusting people or services or healthcare professionals, whatever it might be, and that might make their experience of COVID more frightening, or make it more difficult for them, a higher mountain to climb in terms of their recovery, or in terms of managing, being in that vulnerable state like Karen was talking about earlier. So, I raised that point really because I think if you have had earlier traumas, then I'd want you to take some extra care of yourself, I suppose, as you're starting to recover from COVID-19, because, it's helpful sometimes to think, well, there are services out there. So if you have had previous traumas and now you're having to struggle with COVID, you've already gone over lots of mountains before you got to the COVID mountain. So, that for me would be an extra sign of looking after yourself, making sure that you're doing okay. And if you're not doing okay, making sure that you get the help that is available and that can be really helpful. I hope that's a helpful question. Do let me know if you want me to expand on that anymore.
Okay, there's another question. One great anxiety for me is that I will never get better. There are signs that long COVID sufferers are gradually improving, but what about brain fog, which is really frightening? Is there evidence one can recover from this?
Yeah, and brain fog is something that lots of people experience after ICU. And, my disclosure, I don't work in ICU, I work in the trauma service. So there will be, the long COVID pathway in terms of the ICU doctors there will be able to help you even more with that specific symptom. But that is a common thing that people experience, and there's no evidence to say that it will never go away. But that I think it's important to get help with that. And I think that fear, that overriding fear of kind of I'm going to be like this forever, I'm never going to feel better, is absolutely something that therapy services can be helpful with. We had Anna Mandeville speaking in the last webinar. She's a health psychologist, and it's something that's really common when we've been through a physical health problem, to have that experience of kind of my mind and my body are changed forever and they're never going to feel any better. And it can be a really frightening thought. And once we start to have that thought, it can be really disabling, because every time we have any symptom or we don't feel 100%, we can feel really disabled and frightened. And so it's absolutely something that's really good to be aware of, that you're starting to have that I'm going to be like this forever thought. And it's something to potentially start getting some help with, and as well as the brain fog. But I think if you're having brain fog and you're finding it hard to make sense of what happened in ICU, then I did speak about that a little bit earlier, but speak to the post ICU clinic if there is one. They may well be able to help you make sense of the ICU experience and have some more kind of specific tools to start addressing that brain fog. But you're not on your own with that. Lots of people do describe that. And the ICU Steps website that I put on an earlier slide as well is something to definitely check out, because it was set up by ex-ICU patients. So I'm sure there'll be some useful things on there about that as well. Sorry to not to be more specific.
Okay, my partner is not in healthcare, and I imagine not working in healthcare, and has not been offered vaccination. She has suffered from COVID-19 due to me bringing it home.
Mm-hmm. That must be a really difficult thing to have to manage. I imagine there's a lot of guilt there for yourself as the healthcare professional. I can only imagine what feelings that brings up for you in terms of the fairness and the justice of that. I can't kind of comment on specific who's eligible for vaccines, but I wonder whether that's more the kind of guilt that brings up for you, and the anger, I imagine, that you were out there doing your job, and as part of that your partner became really unwell. So I'm sorry for that.
And someone has asked, what can we do to reassure our partners?
So I'm wondering whether that's you as somebody who experienced COVID-19, and partner might be quite worried about you potentially. So I mean, help them watch the webinar, see if they'll watch the webinar. It'll be on record, and they'd be welcome to watch it afterwards, because hopefully a lot in there is just how kind of normal that it is to struggle when we've been through something that's kind of too much. So that could be something that's helpful. And lots of the PTSD literature and work really is about how humans do have this incredible capacity to overcome adversity, but there's always something that is too much for people. So that mountain that's too high to overcome. And for some partners who are worrying about seeing their loved ones still struggling, they might need to know how normal that is, and give them some things that they can do to help you. So some quite practical tips, like teaching them the grounding, for example, or teaching them the breathing, so that they can coach you with that when it's obvious that you're struggling. The Psychology Tools website that I referenced earlier has got a really helpful booklet on there about post-ICU struggles, and I would really encourage people to read that. It's got some quite practical things in there. Karen, is there anything that you would say as someone who is kind of potentially worried about your partner that you would pass on?
For me, it was certainly about trying to again look at distractions and get a routine, especially after coming out of hospital, and everything was a bit, it was a bit kind of felt a bit chaotic. So it was important that he was kind of having meals at a certain time. We were moving the TV, the news, anything like that, which might trigger some kind of memories. So it was kind of trying to think of, maybe watching films together, and playing board games. It was really, I put a lot of effort, I remember, into just distraction and routine. They were the two things that that I felt was important and seemed to kind of help, because I could see when he might just drift back into some thought about what was maybe what he'd just experienced or was still very fresh in his mind. So it was spend a lot of time, and you know, he was, for me, it was looking back on what he really enjoyed. He was someone who does really enjoy his music, so it was kind of revisiting some of those things that I know was important to him. So I would kind of say routine and distraction for sure. Hope that's of some help.
Okay, and there's another question. How do you get a referral to your trauma service?
Great. So there's lots of trauma services. So there'll be a trauma service in all the different trusts. So this is obviously North Central London. So there'll be trauma services in Camden and Islington, and there are trauma services in Barnet, Enfield, Haringey, but also just kind of all over London there'll be. So for my service in particular, you would go through the GP, and then lots of referrals will be seen in IAPT, who've also got some kind of very skilled clinicians who are very used to working with trauma. And for people who have had a slightly more complicated or complex experience of trauma, they would come to my team in Enfield. But it'll be the same, it's slightly different in all the boroughs, but every borough will have an IAPT service, which is for kind of people who can be seen in maybe slightly fewer sessions, or will have a more specialist trauma service as well. But the starting point for everything will be GP. So please do go to the GP.
Okay, that's all the questions there are now.
Okay. I mentioned earlier about there being lots of apps and that Psychology Tools booklet. If anyone wants a copy of that, then you're welcome to contact me. I'm not sure the best way of kind of doing my contact details, but maybe Iris and Anne can.
Yeah, we'll put the Recovery College email address in the question and answer, and people can email that if they have any queries.
Brilliant. Okay, super. Thank you. Do you want me to close things up, or will someone else do it? Me? Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming. I hope it's been helpful. Thank you for Karen for sharing your experiences as well. It's a really helpful addition to the presentation, I think. And like I say, if you're finding things difficult, then it's because this is a really difficult time. So please do use the support that's out there, and do come to the other webinars. There's lots of helpful speakers who are going to speak about different things. So thank you, and I'll say bye-bye.